Evidences of design. There have been studies, libraries are full of studies that deal with what's called the heptadic structure of Scripture, the sevens, everywhere. Overtly, covertly, in many other ways. In fact, that's where I'm going to shift gears now. We could do probably a whole year's study of examples of the kind of thing I've talked about in the Bible, particularly prophecies. We could talk about Daniel, how Gabriel told Daniel the exact day that Jesus Christ was to present himself on a donkey, and so forth. And we've talked about those kinds of things. But I'd like to take our study in a slightly different direction tonight. I think you've heard me quote the rabbis in Israel. They point out that they really won't understand the Scriptures till the Messiah comes. But when the Messiah comes, he will not only interpret the passages, he'll interpret the very words, even the very letters. In fact, he'll even interpret the spaces between the letters. And when I first heard that, of course, I smiled. I thought it was just a colorful exaggeration. That was until I reread Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 and 18. In the Sermon on the Mount, which is so famous, Jesus makes an interesting remark in verses 17 and 18 of Matthew 5. He says, "Think not that I am come to destroy the Torah or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, not one jot or one tittle shall in no way pass from the law till all be fulfilled." Loosely speaking, it's like the dotting of an I or crossing of a T. The jot actually is the smallest Hebrew letter. It's like it's a sort of a Jewish version of an apostrophe. Okay, just a little jot. A tittle, they have a daleth. They have a downstroke and a little overhang, and that little overhang is called a tittle. So the jot and the tittle are the smallest little marks you can imagine in Jewish writing or printing or whatever. You with me? So this is his remark here, put in our vernacular. It's like saying, "Verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, not the crossing of a T or the dotting of an I will pass, till all be fulfilled." That's a crude Gentile approximation of what he said. I'd like to talk a little bit about jots and tittles tonight. You know, it's a great tragedy in the early centuries of the church that the church became very anti-Semitic. It's shocking when you read some of the writings of people like Martin Luther, who have made many great contributions to the church, but also some of the writings are a real embarrassment. It's amazing to look back at church history and realize how anti-Semitic the church was, even in those early centuries. It was tragic for Jewry, of course, because it was under that kind of a banner so much persecution has occurred through the centuries. It was also tragic for the church, because we've lost much understanding of our Jewish roots. And one of the great discoveries we all have ahead of us is as we begin to unravel some of these Jewish things, to discover insights into Jesus that we didn't know before. We keep forgetting it's a Jewish Bible, a Jewish Messiah, a Jewish King. And it's worth paying some attention to some of these things. One of the things that I'd like to share with you, some strange observations. We have here the page of the book of Genesis in Hebrew. The word Torah in Hebrew is 4 letters, which I'm going to transliterate T-O-R-H. Remember, Hebrew goes from right to left, right? You know, all languages go towards Jerusalem. You knew that, didn't you? Do you know that Hebrew, Aramaic, Sanskrit, Chinese, Japanese all go from what? Right to left, right? Everything, the nations that are west of Jerusalem go from left to right, right? Do you know that? Now, I don't know what you're going to do with that piece of information. What you have there in the upper right-hand corner is Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth and so forth. It's interesting, if you go to the first equivalent to T and count 49 letters and take the next one, and then 49 letters and then take the next one, and then 49 letters and take the next one, it spells Torah. Kind of a curious thing. You say, well, what, you know, I don't know. It's kind of a strange property of the text that separated by 49 letter intervals, we have the name Torah. If we go to the book of Exodus, I don't happen to have a slide for Exodus, but if we go to the book of Exodus, we discover the same thing. You go to the first Te and you count the 49 letters and you get the 4 letters that spell Torah. Now, by now you're kind of curious. Gee, that's kind of strange. If you take a look at the book of Leviticus, that doesn't work. So you go to the book of Numbers, you discover it doesn't work unless you spell Torah backwards. And here, if you spell the bottom of the slide, you see you got Torah spelled backwards. And if you go to the first He and count 49 letters, and then the Resh and 49 letters, and the Vav and 49 letters, and the Teh, you got Torah backwards. Now you're probably wondering who had time on their hands to discover all this stuff, but hey, let's give the rabbis their due. They really studied their text. If you go to the book of Deuteronomy, same thing happens. So now you've got the first two books that's spelled forwards, the last two books that's spelled backwards. Let's examine Leviticus a little more closely. We don't find Torah there, but we do find, separated by 7-letter intervals, not 49, the Tetragrammaton, the Yahweh, the YHWH, as it's usually transliterated in some of your study Bibles. It's interesting, as we stand back, Torah always points to the name of God. Torah forward, forward, and backward, backward. But with Leviticus in the middle, embracing the name of God. And you get to chapter 23, verse 15, you discover they're supposed to count 49 letters. It's calling the count of Omer, and that's how you get from the Omer, from the Feast of First Fruits to Shavuot. And we will do another study of the Feast of Shavuot as it gets closer. The Feast of Shavuot will show up in May, and we will do a special study of the Feast of Pentecost, because there's a possibility that the Feast of Pentecost isn't completely fulfilled yet. And we'll talk about that on another evening. Those of you who want to peek ahead can get Feast of Israel, our study guide on that, and study it. But in the meantime, let's go to something else. One of the interesting mysteries in the Bible is the book of Esther. The book of Esther is a fabulous story, how in the Persian Empire, Queen Vashti was disgraced, and the king picks a new queen and ends up picking Esther, not knowing she was Jewish. She was orphaned as a child, raised by her uncle Mordecai, or cousin, I guess he was, and she rises to power. The villain of the plot is a guy by the name of Haman, who is anxious to wipe out all the Jews. That's kind of a common theme throughout history. Hitler didn't invent the idea. It goes way, 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 way back. That's why Cain killed Abel. That's why the Pharaoh killed the kids where Moses was saved from, etc. There's a plot of Satan against the Messianic line from the beginning. The babes in Bethlehem, etc. But in any case, in the days of Esther, Haman, he was one of those guys that, Saul did not wipe out. He's supposed to wipe out the Agagites, right? And he didn't. And Haman was one of those. See, it wouldn't have come up if Saul had done what God told him to do. But that's a long history. The point is, Haman, he wants to wipe out the Jews. He finagles the king to sign an order for all the Jews to be killed. He builds a gallows that he's going to kill his rival Mordecai on. He's after Mordecai. And of course, the whole plot in Esther gets interesting because what happens, Esther, at the critical time, at risk of her own life, pleads for her people. And to make a long story short, the king issues the decree that in effect saves the Jews. And the big retribution is when Haman is hung on the very gallows he had designed or built for Mordecai. But the book of Esther, while it's a very dramatic event in Israel's history, has been subject to criticism by many authorities, none other than Martin Luther again. I'm not trying to pick on him particularly. I guess I can since I grew up early in the Lutheran church. I'm not picking on the Lutherans, but there are two books that Martin Luther didn't think should belong in the Bible. Esther and Revelation. So we have a little different view, I think, but the point is, the reason many are critical of the book of Esther is they notice that the name of God does not appear in the book of Esther. How many of you have heard the name of God does not appear in the book of Esther? Okay, from now on you won't have to raise your hand because I'm going to show you where the name of God appears 5 times in the book of Esther. But you have to understand a little bit. First of all, you have to understand the way you find these things out is you have to know what the name means. We just got through a genealogy of 10 people in Genesis 5. What does the name Esther mean? It means something hidden. Oh, that's kind of interesting. Now the plot thickens here a little bit. It turns out that God mentioned in Deuteronomy 31 that if Israel turns their back on him, he will hide his face from them. And what's happening here in the book of Esther is God is providing for their safety, but he's doing it invisibly. And it's interesting that the name of God, consistent with the story, is also hidden in the book. Now, how is it hidden? It's hidden in what's called an acrostic. I think all of us may have played at one time or another word games, where you may have a sentence and the first letter of each word in the sentence spells a word and so forth. Okay, you may have played different games of that kind. Any systematic pattern of letters in text can form what's called an acrostic. The simplest one is the first letter of each word, say. It could be the last letter of each word. It could be every third letter, and so on. Well, it turns out that if we look at chapter 1, verse 20, in the English, it and all the wives shall give, etc., and that's the Hebrew. Bear in mind, the Hebrew goes from right to left, okay? Now, if you take the initial letters, but it spells the name of God backwards, okay? Now, it looks forward to us because we're reading it backwards, okay? The Yahweh is backwards. The second acrostic, let's just look at them all first, then I'll make some summaries. In chapter 5, verse 4, well, I should explain in the earlier case, they were formed by the initial letters, and they were going because the event was the initial event. And the name is spelled backwards because God was turning back the counsels of man. Here in the second acrostic, again, it's formed by the initial letters because God is initiating. It is spelled forward because God is overruling or ruling and causing Esther to act. In the third acrostics in chapter 5, verse 13, it's formed by the final letters because Haman's end is approaching. It's spelled backwards because God was overruling Haman's craftiness and so forth. So in this case, it's final letters and backwards. The fourth acrostic is in chapter 7, verse 7. And it's formed by the final letters because Haman's end had come. And it's spelled forward because God was ruling. And the end that he determined was being accomplished. Now, as you look at all of these four acrostics, they're each spoken by a different person. Menucan in chapter 1, verse 20, then Esther 5:4, Haman 5:13, and then by the writer of the book in 7:7. The first two acrostics are a pair because the name is formed by the initial letters. The last two are a pair because they're formed by the final letters. The first and third are a pair because they're spelled backwards. The second and fourth are a pair spelled forward. So you have backward, forward, if you will. The first and third, in which the name is spelled backward, is text spoken by Gentiles. The second and fourth, in which the name is spelled forward, is text spoken by Israelites. Do you get the sense that someone designed this? What a coincidence, huh? Yeah. And there's also some introversions and stuff, and I'll spare you all that right now. But that's not all. There's a fifth one yet. These are the four acrostics with the Yahweh. It turns out that in chapter 7, verse 5, it's not Yahweh that's mentioned. It's the Ihyach, the I am statement of God that he made from the burning bush. Remember the Ihyach Asher Ihyach, I am that I am. If you transliterate it, it would be like EHWH. And this occurs when the king is asking, who is he and where is he that does presume in his heart to do so? And this is the big dramatic declaration of the king at the climax of the book of Esther. And when you take that phrase in the Hebrew, you find hidden in it this acrostic. This is the very I am, the very name of God that when he delivered his people out of the hand of Pharaoh, he used. And here, God is delivering his people out of the hand of Haman. Okay? And of course, all of this is God's way of, on the one hand, protecting his people, but he's doing it hidden, as he said he would. In Deuteronomy 31, he said, they turn away, I'll hide my face from them. He's hidden his face. Doesn't mean he's taking his hand off them. He's there invisibly providing for them in the book of Esther. Kind of interesting? Yeah. Praise God. So don't let anyone tell you the name of God does. Now, you don't have to recount this for someone, but it is, in fact, published in your March newsletter. So if you already received it, this is all old news to you, but I thought you'd find it interesting.